Chapter 1. The Offer. The steady hum of the jet engines was a sound that Captain Jack Callahan had grown so used to, it felt like a second heartbeat. At 38, he had spent half his life in the cockpit and the other half dreaming of getting there. But tonight, as he guided the Boeing 737 through its smooth descent toward Mexico City, a different kind of weight pressed on him. It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't the weather. It was the silence that followed him everywhere these days. "Smooth as silk, Captain," said his co-pilot, Mike Drayton, a fresh-faced kid who still wore his enthusiasm like a badge of honor. "You're a damn magician with these landings." Jack forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks, Mike. Years of practice." The truth was, Jack didn't feel like a magician. He felt like a ghost, drifting through the motions of a life that had once meant everything to him. The cockpit lights reflected in his tired blue eyes, etched with the faint lines of a man who had seen too much. He adjusted the throttle, guiding the plane closer to the runway lights that shimmered in the distance like a beacon. But no light seemed to pierce the darkness inside him. The landing was textbook, as always. The tires kissed the tarmac, the engines roared in reverse thrust, and the plane rolled to a smooth stop at the gate. Applause erupted from the cabin, a tradition Jack had never fully understood, but he gave the passengers what they wanted. A quick word of thanks over the PA system, his voice calm and steady. He was good at being calm and steady, even when his life felt like it was falling apart. Post-flight routine. As the passengers disembarked, Jack remained in the cockpit, going through the shutdown procedures with the meticulous care of a man who needed structure to keep the chaos at bay. Mike chatted idly about his weekend plans, but Jack barely heard him. His mind was elsewhere, on the stack of unpaid bills waiting for him at home, on the bottle of whiskey he'd been trying not to reach for, on the empty spot in his bed that used to belong to someone else. "Big plans tonight, Captain?" Mike asked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Jack glanced up, startled. No, nothing exciting. Just heading back to the hotel." Mike grinned. "Well, if you change your mind, a bunch of us are grabbing drinks at that bar near the airport. You should come. First round's on me." Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "Thanks, Mike, but I'll pass. You have fun." "Suit yourself." Mike gave him a friendly clap on the shoulder before disappearing down the jetway. Jack sat alone in the cockpit for a few more minutes, staring at the controls like they held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Finally, he grabbed his bag and stepped out into the cool night air. The stranger. The airport was quieter than usual, the hum of activity winding down as the clock ticked past midnight. Jack made his way through the terminal, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He was halfway to the exit when he noticed the man. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. The man was tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in an expensive black suit that didn't quite fit with the laid-back atmosphere of the airport. He stood near a row of shuttered gift shops, his dark eyes fixed on Jack with an intensity that made the pilot's skin crawl. Jack ignored him and kept walking, but the man fell into step behind him. "Captain Callahan," the man said, his voice smooth and polite, but with an edge that hinted at something darker. "A moment of your time?" Jack stopped, turning slowly to face the stranger. His instincts, honed over years of flying in unpredictable conditions, told him to be cautious. "Do I know you?" "No," the man said, his lips curling into a faint smile. "But I know you. Jack Callahan, decorated pilot, steady hands in a crisis. You've made quite a name for yourself." Jack frowned. "Who are you and what do you want?" The man stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. "My name is unimportant. What matters is that I represent an organization with a very particular need. A need that you, Captain, are uniquely qualified to fulfill." Jack crossed his arms, his wariness growing. "If this is some kind of sales pitch, I'm not interested." The man chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's not a sales pitch. It's a job offer. A private contract, off the books. 1 flight a month, very well compensated." Jack's first instinct was to walk away. Something about the man, his demeanor, his timing, set off alarm bells. But then he thought about the bills piling up, the mortgage payments he was months behind on, and the career that felt like it was spiraling toward a dead end. He stayed where he was. "I'm listening," he said cautiously. The man's smile widened, like he had just won a game only he understood. "It's a simple task. You'll fly a small aircraft from Mexico to a private island. Each trip, you'll transport 15 passengers. No questions, no deviations from the plan. You drop them off and you leave. That's all." Jack narrowed his eyes. "And the passengers?" "They're none of your concern," the man said smoothly. "You'll never see them again. Your job is to fly, Captain. Nothing more." The unease in Jack's gut twisted tighter. "And if I say no?" The man's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to grow colder. "I'd advise against that, but the choice is yours." Jack studied the man for a long moment. There was something about him, something that spoke of power and danger, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. But there was also the promise of money, enough to dig Jack out of the hole he was in, enough to start over. "Fine," Jack said finally. "I'll do it." The man's smile returned, razor sharp. "Excellent. Someone will contact you with the details. And Captain, discretion is paramount." Jack nodded, his throat dry. The man extended a hand, and after a brief hesitation, Jack shook it. His grip was cold and unyielding. As Jack walked away, the man's voice followed him like a shadow. "Welcome to the team." Foreshadowing. Back in his hotel room, Jack poured himself a glass of water, his mind racing. He tried to tell himself it was just a job, just another paycheck, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with the devil. Outside the window, the city lights stretched endlessly into the night. But somewhere beyond them, out in the vast darkness of the ocean, was an island. An island Jack would soon come to know all too well, and it was waiting for him. Chapter 2. A Growing Unease. The hangar in Mexico City was quieter than Jack had expected. No bustling ground crew, no other planes being serviced, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of jet fuel. The small aircraft he'd been assigned, a sleek twin-engine turboprop, painted matte black with no identifying markings, sat in the center of the cavernous space like a predator waiting to pounce. Jack stood at the edge of the hangar, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and wondered for the 100th time what the hell he had gotten himself into. The mysterious man from the airport had been true to his word. Within days of their meeting, Jack had received a call with instructions, a time, a place, and a promise that he would be handsomely compensated. The money was good, obscenely good, enough to cover his debts and then some. But as Jack stared at the unmarked plane, his unease grew. This wasn't just off the books. This was something else entirely. "Captain Callahan?" A voice broke through his thoughts. Jack turned to see a woman approaching. She was tall and sharp-featured, dressed in a black suit that mirrored the man who had hired him. Her dark hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, and she carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her smile was professional, but her eyes were cold. "Yeah, that's me," Jack said, adjusting the strap of his bag. "Good," she said briskly. "I'm here to brief you on the flight. Follow me." Jack hesitated for a moment before following her to a small office tucked into the corner of the hangar. The room was sparse, just a desk, a few chairs, and a map of the Gulf of Mexico pinned to the wall. The woman gestured for him to sit. "Your flight plan is simple," she began, placing the clipboard in front of him. "You'll depart from this hangar, fly to the coordinates provided, and land on a private airstrip on the island. Once there, you'll offload the passengers and return immediately. No delays, no deviations. Understood?" Jack frowned, leaning forward to study the map. The coordinates were in the middle of nowhere, far from any established routes. "What kind of island is this?" he asked. The woman's smile didn't waver. "Private, that's all you need to know." "And the passengers?" "They'll be arriving shortly. Your job is to fly the plane, Captain. Nothing more." Jack opened his mouth to press further, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was clear she wouldn't entertain questions. He leaned back in his chair, suppressing a sigh. "Fine," he said. "Let's get this over with." The woman nodded, handing him a folder with the flight details. Pre-flight checks are complete. The plane is ready for departure. Your passengers will board in 10 minutes. Jack took the folder and stood, the unease in his gut twisting tighter. As he walked back into the hangar, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger and far darker than he could imagine. The passengers. The passengers arrived in two unmarked vans, pulling into the hangar with the precision of a military convoy. Jack watched from the cockpit as 15 people stepped out, one by one. They moved in silence, their faces blank and unreadable. Most of them were young, men and women in their 20s and 30s, with a few older individuals mixed in. None of them carried luggage. Jack narrowed his eyes. Something about them felt off. They weren't speaking to each other, and their expressions were eerily similar. Flat, detached, almost resigned. As they filed onto the plane, he couldn't help but notice the way they avoided looking at him, or at each other. Once the last passenger was seated, the woman from the office appeared at the base of the stairs. She gave Jack a curt nod. "You're clear for takeoff." Jack hesitated for a moment before climbing into the cockpit. He strapped himself in, ran through the pre-flight checklist, and started the engines. The low rumble filled the hangar, vibrating through the floor and into his bones. He glanced back at the cabin one last time. The passengers sat perfectly still, their faces illuminated by the dim cabin lights. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Jack shook his head, turning back to the controls. "Just a job," he muttered to himself. "Just a goddamn job." The island. The flight was uneventful, but the tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Jack kept glancing at the instruments, then at the coordinates, then at the endless stretch of ocean below. The island finally came into view after 2 hours, a jagged, forested mass rising out of the water like the back of a slumbering beast. The airstrip was barely visible, a thin strip of cleared land tucked against the edge of the jungle. Jack circled once, lining up for the approach, and began his descent. The closer he got, the more unsettled he felt. The island was dark, its dense canopy of trees casting long shadows over the runway. There were no buildings, no lights, no signs of life. He landed smoothly, the tires kicking up a plume of dust as the plane rolled to a stop. As he powered down the engines, he saw movement at the edge of the jungle. Figures emerged from the shadows, silent, watchful, and impossibly still. Jack's pulse quickened. These weren't the passengers. They were something else. Men and women dressed in simple, tattered clothing, their faces streaked with paint. They stood at the edge of the runway, staring at the plane with an intensity that made Jack's skin crawl. The passengers began to disembark, filing down the stairs without a word. Jack stayed in the cockpit, his fingers gripping the controls as he watched them approach the waiting figures. There was no greeting, no exchange of words. The passengers simply disappeared into the jungle, swallowed by the shadows. Jack's unease sharpened into something closer to fear. He wanted to call out, to ask where they were going, but his voice caught in his throat. He didn't belong here. He wasn't meant to see this. The return. The flight back to Mexico was even quieter than the journey out. The empty seats in the cabin felt like ghosts, a reminder of the 15 passengers he had left behind. Jack couldn't stop thinking about the island, the way it had seemed to breathe, alive with some dark, unfathomable energy. When he landed back at the hangar, the woman was waiting for him. She handed him an envelope stuffed with cash and asked only one question. "Will we see you next month?" Jack hesitated, the weight of everything he had seen pressing down on him. But then he thought about the bills, the mortgage, the life that had spiraled so far out of control. He nodded. "Good," the woman said, her cold smile returning. "We'll be in touch." As Jack drove back to his hotel, the darkness of the city seemed to close in around him. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the choice he had made. He told himself it was just a job, just a means to an end. But deep down, he knew better. Chapter 3. Betrayal and Capture. The bar was loud, filled with the kind of music and laughter that Jack could barely tolerate on a good day. He nursed his whiskey in silence, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as his eyes tracked the line of neon lights above the bar. This was Nate's idea, not his. If it were up to him, he'd be at the hotel, trying not to think about the island. But Nate had insisted. "Come on, Jack," Nate had said earlier that evening, his wide grin almost infectious. "You're wound up tighter than a damn drum. You need to relax, and I need to celebrate. I just landed a sweet gig flying private charters. Drinks are on me." Jack had agreed, if only to get Nate off his back. Now, sitting at a sticky bar table with his oldest friend, he wondered if it had been a mistake. Nate Rivers was everything Jack wasn't: outgoing, loud, and perpetually optimistic. His laughter carried across the room, drawing a few curious glances as he clinked his beer bottle against Jack's glass. "To pilots," Nate said with a wink, "the unsung heroes of the skies." Jack forced a smile and took a sip of his whiskey. It burned going down, but the warmth in his chest did little to ease the cold knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in his stomach. "So," Nate said, leaning back in his chair, "what's this new gig you've got? You've been cagey about it." Jack froze, his grip tightening on his glass. He hadn't planned on telling Nate. Hell, he hadn't planned on telling anyone. But the weight of it all, the passengers, the island, the silence that had followed him back each time, was too much to carry alone. "It's complicated," Jack said, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the noise of the bar. Nate raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how? Come on, man, spill. You're not running drugs, are you?" Jack almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. "No, nothing like that. It's just weird." Nate leaned in, his expression suddenly serious. "Weird how?" Jack hesitated, staring into the amber depths of his drink. He trusted Nate. He always had. If anyone could help him make sense of this mess, it was him. But saying it out loud felt dangerous, like he was breaking some unspoken rule. "I fly a private plane out of Mexico," Jack said finally, his voice barely audible. "Once a month, 15 passengers. I drop them off on an island and come back. That's it." Nate frowned. "What kind of passengers?" "I don't know," Jack admitted. "They don't talk. They don't bring luggage. They just sit there. And the island." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's not normal, Nate. Something's not right about it." Nate studied him for a long moment. "You're serious." "Dead serious." "And you've been doing this for how long?" 3 months. Nate whistled, leaning back in his chair. "Jesus, Jack, you couldn't have mentioned this sooner?" "What was I supposed to say?" Jack snapped, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "That I'm flying people to God knows where for God knows what? That I'm being paid stupid money to keep my mouth shut and not ask questions?" Nate raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. All right, take it easy. I get it. But Jack, this doesn't sound like a normal gig. It sounds like you're in some deep shit." "You think I don't know that?" Jack shot back. "Every time I take that plane up, I feel like I'm walking into a trap." "But the money, Nate. I need the money." Nate leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then you need to get out. Now, before it's too late." Jack wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew Nate was right. He should have walked away the moment the man in the suit had approached him. But now, he was in too deep. He could feel it. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Jack's confession hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Nate stood, slapping a few bills onto the table. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here. We'll figure this out." Jack nodded, draining the last of his whiskey before following Nate toward the exit. The night air was cool against his face as they stepped outside, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt a small spark of hope. Maybe Nate was right. Maybe there was a way out of this, but that spark was snuffed out the moment they reached the parking lot. The capture. The black van was waiting for them, its engine idling softly. Jack's heart sank as two men in dark suits stepped out, their expressions cold and unreadable. One of them was the same man who had recruited him, the one with the sharp features and the unnerving smile. "Captain Callahan," the man said, his tone polite but firm. "We need to have a word." Jack instinctively stepped in front of Nate, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to his partner, who produced a syringe from his pocket. Jack barely had time to react before they were on him, their movements quick and efficient. He struggled, but they were stronger and better prepared. The needle plunged into his neck, and the world tilted sideways as his vision blurred. "Jack!" Nate shouted, lunging toward him, but the second man intercepted him with a brutal punch to the gut. Nate doubled over, gasping for air, before he too was subdued. As Jack's knees buckled and his vision darkened, he heard the man's voice one last time. "You should have kept your mouth shut." The island. When Jack woke, his head was pounding, and his mouth tasted like metal. He blinked against the harsh sunlight, his vision slowly coming into focus. He was no longer in Mexico City. He was on the plane, but this time, he wasn't in the cockpit. The roar of the engines filled his ears as he realized he was strapped into one of the passenger seats, his hands bound behind his back. Nate sat beside him, his face bruised and bloodied but alive. Around them, the other passengers sat in eerie silence, staring straight ahead. Jack's stomach twisted. This wasn't a job anymore. This was something else. Something far worse. The plane touched down on the island, and Jack's heart sank as the jungle came into view. The familiar figures emerged from the shadows, waiting to greet them. This time, Jack wouldn't be leaving. Not as the pilot, not as an outsider. He was one of them now. Chapter 4. The Island of Shadows. The first thing Jack noticed was the heat. It pressed down on him like a living thing, thick and suffocating, making every breath feel like a struggle. His head throbbed, his body ached, and the ropes digging into his wrists felt like fire against his skin. He blinked against the harsh sunlight, trying to clear the haze from his vision. The jungle loomed around him, dense and alive with the sounds of insects and distant bird calls. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and the distant crash of waves hinted at the ocean nearby. For a brief, disoriented moment, Jack thought he might still be dreaming. But then he heard the chanting. Low, guttural, and rhythmic, it rose and fell like the tide, sending a cold wave of dread through his body. Jack turned his head, straining against the ropes that bound him, and saw the others. Nate was there, slumped against a tree with his hands tied behind his back. His face was pale, streaked with blood and dirt, but his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Around them, the other passengers sat in eerie silence, their expressions blank. And then there were the tribe members. They stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. Their bodies were painted in streaks of red and black, their faces adorned with bone and feather ornaments. They carried crude weapons, bows, spears, and machetes, and their eyes glinted with a primal predatory hunger. They were waiting. For what, Jack didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. The first escape. "Jack!" Nate's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the chanting. Jack turned to see his friends stirring, his eyes fluttering open. Where the hell are we?" Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "The island," he said. "We're on the island." Nate's eyes widened as the realization hit him. He struggled against the ropes binding his wrists, his movements frantic. "We've got to get out of here. Now." "Working on it," Jack muttered, his mind racing. The ropes were tight, but not impossible. He twisted his wrists, wincing as the fibers bit into his skin. The chanting grew louder, the tribe's voices rising in unison. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing like a drum. He glanced toward the tribe, his stomach turning. They weren't moving yet, but they were watching, waiting. Jack didn't want to be around when they decided to act. "Come on," he hissed, gritting his teeth as he worked the ropes. After what felt like an eternity, he felt a strand snap, then another. Finally, the ropes gave way and his hands were free. He moved quickly, untying Nate's bindings and ignoring the way his hands shook. Nate groaned in pain as he pulled his arms free, but Jack silenced him with a sharp look. "Quiet," Jack whispered. "We don't want to draw attention." Nate nodded, his expression grim. Together, they surveyed their surroundings, searching for a way out. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a wall of green that offered both cover and danger. Jack pointed toward a gap in the trees where the shadows were deepest. "There," he said. "We move fast and quiet. Stick to the trees, got it?" Nate nodded again, his jaw set. "Got it." Jack took a deep breath, his pulse racing. Then, without a word, they bolted. Into the jungle. The jungle swallowed them whole. Branches clawed at their skin. Roots threatened to trip them with every step, and the oppressive heat sapped their strength. Jack pushed forward, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, his ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Behind him, Nate stumbled but kept moving, his determination outweighing his exhaustion. The jungle was a maze of shadows and noise, the distant cries of animals blending with the pounding of their footsteps. And then, the chanting stopped. Jack froze, skidding to a halt. Nate nearly collided with him, his eyes wide with panic. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "They're coming," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it, a primal certainty that sent a chill down his spine. The tribe wasn't chanting anymore because they didn't need to. They were hunting. Jack grabbed Nate's arm and pulled him forward. "Move!" They ran deeper into the jungle, the terrain growing more treacherous with every step. The ground was uneven, slick with mud and littered with jagged rocks. Jack's legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Then he heard it, the faint snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. "They're on us!" Nate shouted, his voice raw with fear. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't waste the breath. Instead, he pushed harder, his body protesting with every step. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting into shapes that felt almost alive. An arrow whizzed past Jack's head, embedding itself in a tree trunk. He ducked instinctively, his heart hammering in his chest. Another followed, striking the ground just inches from Nate's feet. "They're shooting at us!" Nate yelled, his voice cracking. "No shit!" Jack snapped, grabbing Nate's arm and pulling him to the side. They veered off the faint path they'd been following, plunging into thicker undergrowth. The branches tore at their clothes, leaving angry red welts on their skin. The tribe was close now. Jack could hear their footsteps, their guttural voices, the twang of bowstrings. Arrows rained down around them, thudding into the ground and splintering against the trees. Jack's mind raced, searching for a plan, an escape, anything to get them out of this alive. "There," Nate shouted, pointing to a rocky outcrop ahead. It jutted out from the jungle floor, its surface uneven but climbable. Jack didn't hesitate. They scrambled up the rocks, their hands and feet finding purchase on the rough surface. Arrows clattered against the stone, the tribe's voices growing louder as they closed in. At the top of the outcrop, Jack turned to survey their surroundings. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of green that offered no answers. But to the east, he caught a glimpse of the ocean, a glimmer of hope in the distance. "There's water that way," he said, pointing. "We head for the shore." Nate nodded, his face pale but determined. "Lead the way." Jack didn't hesitate. They climbed down the far side of the outcrop, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the tribe. The voices faded, but Jack knew they weren't safe. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The first loss. As night fell, the jungle transformed into a different kind of nightmare. The darkness was absolute, pierced only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the canopy. Every sound set Jack on edge. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal, the faint snap of a branch. They found a small clearing and stopped to catch their breath. Jack leaned against a tree, his body trembling with exhaustion. Nate sat on the ground, clutching his side where a sharp branch had cut through his shirt. "What the hell is this place?" Nate asked, his voice shaking. "What the hell are they?" Jack didn't have an answer. He stared into the darkness, his mind racing. The island wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, waiting, and they were prey. "We keep moving," Jack said finally. We don't stop until we find a way off this island. But as they set off into the jungle once more, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the island had other plans. Chapter 5. The Jungle Hungers. Jack's boots sank into the soft, damp earth with every step, the wet soil sucking at his heels like the island itself was trying to pull him down. The darkness of the jungle had swallowed them whole, the faint light of the moon above doing little to pierce the canopy. In the silence, every sound felt amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant rustling in the trees, the faint hum of insects that never seemed to stop. Nate stumbled behind him, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He had been limping for the last mile, his body clearly reaching its limit. Jack glanced back, his jaw tightening as he saw the strain etched into his friend's face. "We need to rest," Nate panted, leaning heavily against a tree. I can't keep going like this." Jack wanted to argue, to tell him that stopping was a death sentence, but he knew Nate was right. They had been running for hours, and the relentless pace was taking its toll. The adrenaline that had carried them this far was fading, leaving behind only exhaustion and pain. "All right," Jack said reluctantly, his voice low. "Just for a few minutes. We can't stay in one place too long." Nate nodded, sliding down the tree trunk until he was sitting on the ground. He winced as he pulled up his pant leg, revealing a nasty gash on his shin. The wound was shallow but angry-looking, the edges red and swollen. Jack crouched beside him, pulling a small knife from his pocket. "Let me see." "I'm fine," Nate muttered. But he didn't resist as Jack ripped a strip of fabric from his shirt and began cleaning the wound as best he could. The jungle offered no clean water, no supplies, no safety. Every small injury felt like a potential death sentence in this place. "We'll find a way out of this," Jack said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We just have to keep moving." Nate didn't respond. He stared into the distance, his eyes unfocused. Jack followed his gaze, his stomach tightening as he realized what Nate was looking at. The trees, they were wrong. Jack hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The trunks twisted unnaturally, their bark knotted and cracked like old scars. The branches reached out like skeletal fingers, their leaves rustling even though there was no wind. The jungle felt alive, not just with the sounds of animals and insects, but with something deeper, something malevolent. "Do you feel that?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded slowly. "Yeah, I feel it." The jungle wasn't just a place, it was a predator, and they were its prey. The hunt resumes. The reprieve was short-lived. Jack's ears pricked at the faint sound of movement in the distance, a rhythmic rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. His heart sank as he recognized the sound. Footsteps. "They're coming," he hissed, grabbing Nate by the arm and pulling him to his feet. "We have to go, now." Nate groaned but didn't argue. He staggered after Jack as they plunged deeper into the jungle, their movements clumsy and desperate. The footsteps grew louder, joined by the faint murmur of voices. The tribe was close, too close. Jack's mind raced as he scanned their surroundings. The jungle was a labyrinth, the dense foliage offering both cover and obstacles. Every step felt like a gamble. He wanted to believe they could outrun the tribe, but deep down he knew better. The tribe knew this island. They didn't. An arrow zipped past Jack's head, embedding itself in a tree with a dull thunk. He ducked instinctively, pulling Nate down with him. The two men crouched low, their breaths coming in harsh, uneven gasps. "They're on us," Nate whispered, his voice trembling. Jack's eyes darted around, searching for any advantage. His gaze landed on a thick cluster of vines hanging from a nearby tree. Without thinking, he grabbed one and began climbing. "Come on," he said, motioning for Nate to follow. "Up here." Nate hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "You want us to climb? Are you out of your mind?" "Do you have a better idea?" Jack shot back. "They're faster than us on the ground. We need to get higher." Nate cursed under his breath but followed, his movements slow and clumsy. The vines were slick with moisture, making the climb treacherous. Jack gritted his teeth, his muscles burning as he pulled himself higher. Below, he heard the tribe closing in, their voices rising in a haunting chant. The canopy's secret. The climb was brutal, but they made it. Jack hauled himself onto a thick branch, gasping for air as he leaned against the trunk of the tree. Nate collapsed beside him, his face pale and drenched with sweat. For a moment, they sat in silence, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The chanting grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Jack felt his stomach twist as he realized what that meant. "They know we're here," he whispered. Nate looked at him, his eyes wide. "How?" "They always know," Jack said grimly. "This is their island. We're just trespassers." As if on cue, the jungle erupted with noise. The tribe was no longer trying to be quiet. They moved with purpose, their voices rising in a chorus of guttural cries. Jack peered through the leaves, his heart pounding as he saw the shadows moving below. "They're spreading out," he said, "looking for us." Nate swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. The canopy had seemed like a good idea, but now it felt like a trap. They were sitting ducks up here with nowhere to run. And then he saw it. A narrow gap in the foliage, leading to another tree. Beyond that, another gap. The branches stretched out like a precarious bridge, offering a potential escape route. It was risky. One wrong step and they'd fall to their deaths. But it was better than waiting to be found. "We move," Jack said, pointing to the gap. "Carefully. Stay close." Nate nodded, his face pale but determined. "Got it." Jack led the way, his movements slow and deliberate. The branch creaked under his weight, but it held. He reached the next tree and motioned for Nate to follow. "Come on," he said. "You can do this." Nate hesitated, his hands trembling as he gripped the branch. He took a tentative step forward, then another. The branch swayed, and Jack held his breath. Then, with a sickening crack, the branch gave way. "Nate!" Jack lunged forward, grabbing his friend by the arm. Nate dangled precariously, his legs kicking as he tried to find purchase. Below, the tribe erupted into a frenzy, their cries echoing through the jungle. "I've got you," Jack grunted, his muscles straining as he pulled Nate up. "Hold on!" Nate's fingers slipped, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jack thought he was going to lose him. But with one final heave, he managed to haul Nate onto the branch. They collapsed together, their chests heaving as the jungle roared around them. "We can't keep this up," Nate said, his voice shaking. "We're not going to make it." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. But even as the despair threatened to consume him, Jack made a silent vow. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this. The island's wrath. The night stretched on, the jungle alive with the relentless sounds of the hunt. Jack and Nate pressed forward, their bodies battered and broken but still moving. The ocean was their only hope. The promise of escape shimmering on the horizon like a distant, unreachable dream. But the island wasn't done with them yet. It wasn't just the tribe hunting them. The jungle itself seemed to rise against them, its tangled roots and twisted branches conspiring to slow their progress. Jack could feel it watching, a malevolent presence that seeped into his bones. "We keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse. "We don't stop." But deep down, he knew the truth. The island wouldn't let them go. Chapter 6. The First Kill. The jungle was alive with sound, branches snapping, leaves crunching, guttural voices rising and falling like a twisted symphony of chaos. Jack and Nate hadn't stopped moving since the branch had nearly sent Nate crashing to his death. But no matter how far they ran, the sound of their pursuers remained close. Too close. "They're toying with us," Jack muttered, his voice tight with exhaustion. He crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, his chest heaving. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes. His entire body screamed for rest, but he couldn't afford to stop. Stopping meant death. Nate slumped beside him, his face pale and drawn. "They've got us surrounded, don't they?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written in the grim set of his jaw. The tribe wasn't just hunting them. They were corral-selling them, herding them like cattle toward some unseen destination. Jack didn't know what awaited them at the end of the hunt, but he had no intention of finding out. "We can't outrun them," Nate said, his voice shaking. Jack, we're— Don't, Jack snapped, cutting him off. Don't say it. Nate fell silent, his eyes darting nervously through the dense foliage. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing deeper, the air heavier. Jack's ears strained for any sign of movement, any indication of where the tribe might be. And then he heard it. A faint rustle, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Jack's grip tightened on the jagged branch he had picked up earlier, his makeshift weapon crude but effective. He raised a hand, signaling for Nate to stay quiet. The rustling grew louder, closer. Jack's pulse quickened. He crouched lower, his muscles coiled like a spring. The seconds stretched into an eternity as he waited, his breath shallow and controlled. Then the first figure emerged. The tribesman moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his painted body blending seamlessly with the shadows. He carried a long spear, the tip glinting faintly in the moonlight. His eyes scanned the jungle, sharp and unrelenting. Jack's grip tightened on the branch. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it made his stomach churn. He wasn't a killer. He was a pilot, for God's sake. But survival didn't care about morality. It didn't care about who you were before. It only cared about who you were willing to become. The first strike. Jack waited until the tribesman was just a few feet away. He could hear the man's steady breathing, the faint creak of leather straps around his chest. Jack's own breathing was shallow, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might give him away. And then he struck. Jack lunged from the shadows, swinging the branch with all the strength he could muster. The jagged end caught the tribesman in the side of the head with a sickening crack. The man staggered, dropping his spear as he clutched at his temple. Jack didn't hesitate. He brought the branch down again, this time aiming for the man's chest. The impact sent the tribesman sprawling to the ground, his body twitching before going still. The jungle fell silent. Jack stood over the body, his chest heaving, the branch trembling in his bloodied hands. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. He had killed before, in simulations, in emergencies. But this was different. This was personal, raw, brutal. "Jack," Nate whispered, his voice shaking. "Jack, we have to go." Jack snapped out of his trance, his gaze shifting to Nate. His friend's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. Jack nodded, dropping the branch as he grabbed Nate's arm. "Come on," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "They'll have heard that. We need to move." They ran. The cost of violence. The jungle seemed angrier now, as if it had felt the death of one of its own. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker. Jack and Nate pushed forward, their bodies running on pure adrenaline. But the weight of what Jack had done followed them, a heavy shadow that clung to his every step. "You saved us," Nate said after a long silence. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "If you hadn't done that—" Jack didn't respond. He didn't want to think about the alternative, but he couldn't shake the image of the tribesman's face, the way his eyes had gone wide with shock in his final moments. Jack had been faster, stronger. But for how long? "They're not going to stop," Jack said finally. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "They're going to keep coming." Nate nodded, his jaw tightening. "So what do we do?" Jack glanced at the jagged branch still clutched in his hand. "We fight." The clearing. They stumbled into a clearing just as dawn began to break. The pale light of morning cast the jungle in an eerie glow, the shadows retreating but never fully disappearing. In the center of the clearing stood a strange structure, a crude altar made of stone and bone, its surface stained dark with what Jack could only assume was blood. Nate froze, his eyes locked on the altar. "What the hell is that?" Jack didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the symbols carved into the stone, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as he stared at them. He felt a strange pull, a sensation that made his stomach churn and his head swim. "This isn't just a hunt," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a ritual." Nate turned to him, his face pale. "What kind of ritual?" Jack shook his head, his mind racing. The tribe's relentless pursuit, the eerie chanting, the strange way the jungle seemed to come alive, it all pointed to something far darker than he had imagined. "We're not just prey," Jack said, his voice trembling. "We're part of something bigger, something wrong." Before Nate could respond, the jungle erupted with noise. The tribe was closing in, their cries echoing through the tree. Jack's grip tightened on his makeshift weapon as he turned to face the sound. "We make our stand here," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "No more running." Nate nodded, grabbing a heavy rock from the ground. "If we go down fighting." The cries grew louder, the shadows at the edge of the clearing shifting as the first figures emerged. Jack's heart pounded, his body trembling as he prepared for the fight of his life. The island wanted blood, and it was about to get it. Chapter 7. The Fight for Survival. The jungle erupted around them. The first tribesman burst into the clearing, his painted body blending so seamlessly with the surrounding shadows that he seemed to materialize out of the air. Jack barely had time to react. The man lunged toward him, wielding a jagged spear tipped with stone. Jack swung his makeshift weapon, a broken branch still slick with the blood of the tribesman he'd killed earlier. The wood connected with a sickening thud, catching the attacker across the jaw and sending him sprawling to the ground. Jack didn't stop. He brought the branch down again and again until the man stopped moving. "Jack!" Nate's voice snapped him out of his trance. Jack turned just in time to see another tribesman charging toward Nate, his machete gleaming in the pale morning light. Nate stumbled back, raising the heavy rock in his hands as a pathetic shield. Jack didn't think, he just moved. He tackled the attacker, sending both of them crashing to the ground. The tribesman was fast, faster than Jack had anticipated. He twisted out of Jack's grip, his machete slashing through the air in a wide arc. Jack ducked, the blade missing his face by inches, and drove his knee into the man's stomach. The tribesman let out a wheezing grunt, but his grip on the machete didn't falter. Jack scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to the altar in the center of the clearing. His mind raced. The altar was covered in jagged shards of bone, their edges sharpened to deadly points. He didn't have time to think about what they were for. He just knew they were his best chance. The tribesman lunged at him again, the machete slicing through the air. Jack sidestepped the blow, grabbed the man by the wrist, and used his momentum to slam him face first into the altar. There was a sickening crunch as the man's head collided with the stone. He crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Jack staggered back, his chest heaving. His hands were trembling, his knuckles slick with blood. His or theirs, he couldn't tell anymore. He turned to find Nate struggling with another tribesman, the two of them grappling in the dirt like animals. Nate's face was twisted with pain and desperation, his grip on the rock slipping. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen machete and charged, bringing the blade down with all his strength. The tribesman let out a guttural scream as the blade sank into his back. He collapsed, his body twitching before going still. Nate pushed the body off him, gasping for air. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, his voice trembling. "What the hell is this, Jack? What the hell is happening?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too focused on the sounds of movement in the jungle, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches. There were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, and they were closing in. "We have to go," Jack said that, his voice hoarse. "Now." The jungle's wrath. They ran. The jungle seemed to come alive around them, the dense foliage twisting and shifting as if it were trying to trap them. Vines snagged at their limbs, roots rose up to trip them, and the oppressive heat sapped their strength with every step. Jack could feel the island watching them, its presence pressing down on him like a physical weight. The cries of the tribe followed them, a haunting cacophony that echoed through the trees. Jack didn't dare look back. He knew they were close. He could feel them, like a predator breathing down his neck. Nate stumbled beside him, his face pale and drenched with sweat. His limp had worsened, and every step seemed to cost him more than the last. Jack grabbed his arm, half dragging him forward. "Keep moving," Jack said through gritted teeth. "We're not stopping." "I can't," Nate gasped, his voice breaking. "Jack, I can't." "You don't have a choice," Jack snapped, his voice raw with desperation. "You stop. You die. It's that simple." Nate's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. He pushed himself forward, his breaths ragged and uneven. Jack felt a pang of guilt, but he shoved it aside. Survival didn't leave room for guilt. Or mercy. The cave. They broke through the undergrowth and found themselves standing at the edge of a steep ravine. Below, a river wound its way through the jungle, the water dark and fast-moving. To their left, the rocky face of the ravine rose up, dotted with jagged outcroppings and narrow ledges. A small cave entrance was visible about halfway up, partially hidden by vines. Jack's mind raced. The cave was risky. If the tribe found them, they'd be trapped, but it was their only option. The river was too far below to jump, and there was no time to find another path. "There," Jack said, pointing to the cave. "We climb." Nate stared at the sheer rock face, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you insane? I can barely walk, let alone climb." Jack grabbed him by the shoulders, forcing him to meet his gaze. "You can do this, Nate. You have to." Nate hesitated, then nodded. Together, they began the climb. The rock face was slick with moss, every handhold and foothold treacherous. Jack moved quickly, his muscles burning with exertion. Behind him, Nate struggled, his injured leg making the climb nearly impossible. Jack glanced back, his heart sinking as he saw the tribe emerging from the jungle. "They're coming!" Nate shouted, his voice filled with panic. Jack reached the cave first, pulling himself onto the narrow ledge. He turned and extended his hand to Nate. "Come on, you're almost there." Nate gritted his teeth, his face twisted with pain as he reached for Jack's hand. Their fingers brushed, and Jack pulled him up just as an arrow whizzed past them, striking the rock with a sharp crack. They collapsed inside the cave, their chests heaving. Jack crawled to the entrance and peered out. The tribe had reached the base of the ravine. They were shouting, their voices rising in anger as they pointed toward the cave. "They're not climbing," Jack said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and confusion. "Why aren't they climbing?" Nate sat up, wincing as he clutched his injured leg. "Maybe they can't?" Jack shook his head. "No, it's not that. They're scared." Nate frowned. "Scared of what?" Jack didn't answer. His gaze shifted to the back of the cave, where the darkness seemed to pulse and writhe like a living thing. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the faint stench of decay hung heavy. "We're not alone," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. The heart of the island. The deeper they moved into the cave, the colder it became. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the stone with meticulous precision. Jack ran his fingers over them, his skin prickling at the touch. The symbols seemed to hum with energy, vibrating faintly beneath his fingertips. "This place," Nate said, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" Jack didn't respond. He didn't have an answer. But he could feel it, the same presence he had felt since they'd arrived on the island. It was stronger here, more concentrated. The cave wasn't just a hiding place. It was something else, something ancient. As they rounded a corner, the narrow tunnel opened into a massive chamber. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The walls were lined with bones, human bones, arranged in intricate patterns that spiraled toward the center of the room. At the center stood a massive stone pillar, its surface covered in the same symbols as the walls. The pillar pulsed faintly, a rhythmic glow that seemed to synchronize with Jack's heartbeat. He took a step closer, his body moving on its own, drawn to the pillar like a moth to a flame. "Jack," Nate said, his voice filled with fear. "Don't." But Jack couldn't stop. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the surface of the stone. The moment his fingers brushed the cold surface, a surge of energy shot through him, and the world went white. Chapter 8. The Edge of Survival. The clearing was empty, save for the altar. The jagged stone structure loomed over the space, its surface stained dark with years, maybe centuries, of sacrifices. Jack and Nate crouched in the undergrowth at the edge of the clearing, their breathing shallow, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Nate's voice was barely above a whisper. "You think they're gone?" Jack shook his head, his eyes scanning the tree line. "No, they're close. Watching." The tribe had been relentless, hunting them through the night with the precision of predators who knew this jungle better than their own skin. Jack had lost count of the times they had narrowly avoided capture, ducking into thick undergrowth, scrambling up rocky outcrops, wading through waist-deep rivers to mask their scent. But no matter how far or fast they ran, the tribe was always behind them. Patient, methodical. Jack's eyes lingered on the altar. It was a grim centerpiece to this nightmare, its surface adorned with crude carvings and the remnants of old offerings, bones, dried blood, scraps of fabric. His stomach churned at the thought of what had happened here, what might still happen if they didn't find a way off the island. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice low. "They'll be back." Nate shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "I can't keep running, Jack. I'm done. My leg's killing me, and I haven't eaten in, hell, I don't even know how long." Jack grabbed Nate's arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "You don't have a choice. None of us do." Nate's eyes flicked to the altar, his expression haunted. "What is this place? Why are they doing this?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. The tribe wasn't going to stop until they were dead. Or worse. The first trap. The two men moved cautiously through the jungle, their senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call set their nerves on edge. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to their skin like a second layer of clothing. The dense foliage offered some cover, but it also made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack led the way, machete in hand. He had taken it from one of the tribesmen during their last encounter, a brutal struggle that had left Jack with a gash on his forearm and a sick feeling in his gut. He hated the weight of the weapon in his hand, but he hated the thought of being unarmed even more. "Careful," Jack whispered, his eyes scanning the ground ahead. "They like to set traps." Nate nodded, his limp more pronounced with every step. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing labored. Jack knew he was running on fumes, but there was nothing he could do. Stopping wasn't an option. They moved through a narrow gully, the sides rising steeply on either side. The ground was littered with loose rocks and fallen branches, forcing them to pick their way carefully. Jack's gut told him this was a bad place to be. Too exposed, too easy to trap. But there was no other way forward. They were halfway through when it happened. A sudden snap, a tripwire hidden beneath the leaves. Jack barely had time to shout a warning before a spiked log swung down from the trees, its momentum carrying it directly into their path. "Move!" Jack shouted, grabbing Nate and pulling him to the side. The log missed them by inches, slamming into the ground with a thunderous crash. Splinters flew in every direction, and the sound echoed through the jungle like a gunshot. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the trees. The tribe would have heard that. They would be coming. "We have to go," Jack said, his voice tight. Nate nodded, his face pale. "They're hurting us." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew Nate was right. The elements turned. As the sun climbed higher, the jungle became a furnace. The heat was oppressive, the humidity suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling steam. Sweat dripped from Jack's brow, stinging his eyes and soaking his shirt. Nate was in worse shape, his limp slowing them to a crawl. "We need water," Nate said. Yet, his voice weak. "I'm not going to make it much longer." Jack scanned the jungle, his eyes searching for any sign of a stream or river. The island was thick with vegetation, but water wasn't always easy to find. They had come across a few muddy pools, but Jack hadn't trusted them. The last thing they needed was to get sick. "There," Jack said, pointing to a faint game trail winding through the trees. "Animals use these. It might lead to water." Nate didn't argue. He followed Jack down the trail, his steps unsteady. The jungle pressed in around them, the air filled with the buzz of insects and the distant calls of unseen animals. Jack's senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves putting him on edge. They found the stream a short while later, a narrow ribbon of clear water cutting through the jungle. Jack knelt beside it, cupping his hands and taking a cautious sip. It tasted clean, free of the metallic tang that often came with stagnant water. "Drink," Jack said, motioning to Nate. "But not too much. We don't know when we'll find more." Nate dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he scooped up the water. He drank greedily, his face slack with relief. Jack kept watch, his machete resting across his knees. The jungle felt too quiet, the absence of animal sounds setting his nerves on edge. "They're watching us," Jack said, his voice low. Nate looked up, water dripping from his chin. "What?" Jack gestured to the trees, his eyes scanning the shadows. "The tribe. They're out there, waiting." Nate swallowed hard, his face paling. "What do we do?" Jack stood, his grip tightening on the machete. "We move, and we don't stop." The reality of death. They didn't make it far before the tribe struck. The first arrow came out of nowhere, embedding itself in the tree trunk just inches from Jack's head. He ducked instinctively, pulling Nate down with him. More arrows followed, the sharp thwack of wood against bark filling the air. "They're flanking us!" Jack shouted, dragging Nate into a dense thicket of underbrush. The branches scratched at their skin, but it offered some cover. Jack crouched low, his eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of their attackers. He saw them then. Figures moving through the trees, their bodies painted in streaks of red and black. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their weapons raised. Jack's stomach churned. There were too many of them. "We can't fight them," Nate said, his voice trembling. "There's no way." Jack nodded, his mind racing. "Then we don't. We run." They bolted, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. The jungle seemed to conspire against them, its tangled roots and low-hanging branches slowing their progress. Jack could hear the tribe behind them, their guttural shouts growing closer. An arrow grazed Jack's shoulder, the pain sharp and immediate. He stumbled but kept moving, adrenaline pushing him forward. Nate was lagging behind, his injured leg slowing him down. "Go!" Nate shouted, his voice raw. "Don't wait for me!" "Shut up!" Jack snapped, grabbing Nate's arm and hauling him forward. "We're not splitting up." A desperate plan. They reached a shallow ravine, its rocky walls offering a precarious path downward. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Nate and began climbing, his hands and feet finding purchase on the uneven surface. The tribe's shouts grew louder, their footsteps echoing through the jungle. "We'll lose them in the ravine," Jack said, more to himself than to Nate. "We just have to keep moving." But as they descended, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were only delaying the inevitable. The tribe wasn't going to stop. The jungle wasn't going to let them go. Their only chance was to turn the hunters into the hunted. Chapter 9. Turning the Tables. The ravine was a maze of jagged rocks and loose scree, the kind of terrain that punished every misstep with a twisted ankle or worse. Jack and Nate scrambled down its steep walls, their hands and feet finding purchase on the rough stone. The sound of the tribe's pursuit echoed from above, their guttural shouts and the occasional snap of a branch a constant reminder that they were close. Too close. Jack's shoulder throbbed where the arrow had grazed him, the blood trickling down his arm sticky and warm. His breathing was ragged, his legs trembling with exhaustion. But he didn't stop. The ravine offered a slim chance of escape, and he wasn't about to waste it. Behind him, Nate slipped, his foot skidding on a patch of loose gravel. He let out a sharp cry as he fell, landing hard on his side. Jack turned back, his heart sinking as he saw Nate clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. "Get up," Jack hissed, rushing to his side. "We don't have time for this." "I think I twisted it," Nate groaned, his voice tight with pain. "I can't." "You can," Jack snapped, his grip firm as he hauled Nate to his feet. "They're right behind us. You don't have a choice." Nate gritted his teeth, leaning heavily on Jack as they continued down the ravine. Every step was a struggle. the loose rocks shifting beneath their feet. But they kept moving. The tribe's voices grew louder, closer, the sound of their pursuit relentless. Jack's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them. Not like this. If they didn't find a way to slow the tribe down, they were dead. The plan. They reached the bottom of the ravine, where a narrow stream wound its way through the rocks. The water was cold and clear, its gentle babble a sharp contrast to the chaos above. Jack crouched beside it, scanning the area for anything they could use. The ravine walls were steep, the rock jagged and uneven. A few boulders jutted out at odd angles, their surfaces slick with moss. Jack's eyes lingered on one of the larger boulders, precariously balanced near the edge of the ravine wall. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous, but it was all they had. "Nate," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "We're going to make a stand here." Nate's eyes widened in panic. "Are you out of your mind? There's too many of them." "We don't need to fight them all," Jack said. "We just need to slow them down. See that boulder?" He pointed to the massive rock above them. "If we can dislodge it, we can block the path. Maybe take a few of them out in the process." Nate stared at the boulder, then back at Jack. "And how the hell are we supposed to do that?" Jack grabbed the machete from his belt, its blade dull and chipped from constant use. "We climb, we hack at whatever's holding it in place, and we pray it works." Nate hesitated, his fear evident, but he nodded. "All right, let's do it." The climb. The climb was brutal. Every muscle in Jack's body screamed in protest as he hauled himself up the ravine wall, the jagged rock cutting into his hands. Nate followed behind him, his movements slower and more labored. His injured leg made the ascent treacherous, but he didn't complain. He didn't have the energy to complain. The boulder loomed above them, its surface rough and uneven. It was wedged tightly between two outcroppings, held in place by a tangle of roots and smaller rocks. Jack could see the path the tribe would take below, a narrow section of the ravine that funneled them directly beneath the boulder. "It's perfect," Jack said, his breath coming in short bursts. "If we can get it loose, they won't stand a chance." Nate nodded, his face pale as he clung to the rock. "Just tell me what to do." Jack handed him the machete. "Start hacking at the roots. I'll work on the rocks." Nate took the blade, his hands trembling, and began chopping at the thick roots holding the boulder in place. The sound of the machete striking wood echoed through the ravine, sharp and rhythmic. Jack dug at the smaller rocks with his hands, prying them loose one by one. The boulder shifted slightly, a low groan emanating from deep within the rock. "They're coming," Nate said, his voice tight with panic. He glanced down at the ravine floor, where the first of the tribesmen were beginning to appear. Their painted faces glinted in the sunlight, their weapons held high as they scanned the area. "Keep going," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "We're almost there." Nate nodded, his movements frantic as he hacked at the last of the roots. Jack shoved another rock free, his hands bleeding from the effort. The boulder shifted again, this time more noticeably, its weight straining against the remaining supports. "They see us," Nate shouted, his voice rising in panic. Jack looked down. The tribesmen had spotted them, their guttural cries growing louder as they began climbing the ravine walls. The sight sent a jolt of adrenaline through Jack's body, spurring him into action. "One more push," Jack shouted. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. The avalanche. Jack and Nate threw their combined weight against the boulder, their muscles straining with the effort. For a moment, it seemed like it wouldn't budge. Then with a deep, resonant groan, the boulder broke free. Time seemed to slow as the massive rock tumbled down the ravine wall, gathering speed as it went. It struck the ground with a deafening crash, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. Smaller rocks followed, cascading down in a makeshift avalanche. The tribesmen didn't stand a chance. The boulder slammed into the narrow path, crushing 2 of the attackers instantly. The rest scrambled to avoid the falling debris, their cries of rage and terror echoing through the ravine. The path was blocked, the way forward choked with rubble. Jack and Nate clung to the ravine wall, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, The only sound was the distant roar of the stream below. "We did it," Nate said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his chest heaving. "Yeah, we did." But even as they climbed down, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The tribe might have been slowed, but they weren't defeated. And the island was still waiting. The cost of survival. They made their way back to the stream, their bodies battered and broken but alive. Jack knelt beside the water, washing the blood and dirt from his hands. His reflection stared back at him, pale and hollow-eyed, barely recognizable. Nate sat beside him, his injured legs stretched out in front of him. "What now?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Jack didn't answer immediately. He stared at the jungle, its dense foliage hiding dangers they couldn't begin to understand. The altar, the tribe, the endless pursuit. It all felt insurmountable. "We keep moving," Jack said finally, his voice hard. "We find a way off this island, one way or another." Nate nodded, his jaw set. "All right, let's do it." But as they set off once more, Jack couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in the back of his mind. The tribe wasn't just hunting them, they were protecting something. And Jack feared that whatever it was, they were getting closer to it with every step. Chapter 10. A line in the sand. The jungle seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, an unbroken wall of green that offered no answers, no escape. Jack and Nate moved cautiously through the dense foliage, every step an effort as exhaustion dragged at their limbs. The adrenaline that had carried them through the ravine was gone now, leaving only the raw ache of overworked muscles and the gnawing hunger that twisted their stomachs. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his machete held tightly in one hand. The blade was dull and chipped, but it was still better than nothing. He glanced back at Nate, who was limping heavily, his face pale and drawn. "You need to keep up," Jack said, his voice low but firm. Nate shot him a glare. "I'm doing the best I can." Jack didn't respond. He knew Nate was pushing himself to the limit, but it wasn't enough. The tribe wasn't far behind. They never were. The boulder trap had slowed them down, but it hadn't stopped them. Nothing ever seemed to stop them. Jack's eyes scanned the jungle, searching for any sign of danger. The thick canopy above cast the ground in shadow, the air heavy with humidity. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call set his nerves on edge. They were being hunted, and the tribe wasn't just after their lives. They were after their fear. "We need to find higher ground," Jack said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "If we can get a better view, maybe we can figure out where the hell we are." Nate let out a bitter laugh. "Does it even matter? We're stuck on this godforsaken island with no food, no water, and a bunch of lunatics trying to kill us. Higher ground isn't going to change that." Jack stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "You want to give up? Fine. But I'm not dying here, and neither are you. Now, come on." Nate's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He adjusted the makeshift sling Jack had fashioned for his injured arm and followed, his limp more pronounced with every step. The ridge. After hours of trudging through the dense jungle, they finally reached a ridge that rose sharply above the surrounding terrain. The climb was steep, the loose soil and jagged rocks making every step a struggle. Jack and Nate moved in silence, their breaths labored, their bodies screaming for rest. When they reached the top, the view was both awe-inspiring and demoralizing. The jungle stretched out below them, an endless sea of green that seemed to go on forever. In the distance, the faint outline of the coastline shimmered in the heat haze, the ocean a tantalizing promise of escape. But between them and the shore was nothing but jungle. And somewhere in that jungle, the tribe was waiting. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Nate said, his voice barely audible. Jack shook his head. "No, they're not." Nate sank to the ground, his face buried in his hands. "This is insane. They're not just trying to kill us, they're hunting us, like animals." Jack crouched beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They're protecting something." Nate looked up, his expression incredulous. "Protecting what? This place is a nightmare. What could possibly be worth all this?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have an answer, but the thought had been gnawing at him since they'd first arrived. The altar, the carvings, the rituals, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. The tribe wasn't just killing for sport. There was a purpose to their madness. "We keep moving," Jack said finally, his voice hard. "We stick to the ridge, follow it toward the coast. If we can make it to the water, maybe we can find a way off this island." Nate let out a hollow laugh. "And what if we can't?" Jack met his gaze, his expression grim. "Then we die trying." The jungle's edge. The ridge offered a brief reprieve from the suffocating undergrowth of the jungle, but the exposed position came with its own dangers. Jack and Nate moved quickly, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the tribe. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape and bathing the jungle in a golden light that did little to mask its dangers. As they walked, Jack's thoughts drifted to the passengers. The silent, expressionless people he had ferried to this island month after month. He had never questioned their purpose, never asked where they were going or why. But now, the pieces were starting to come together. "They weren't tourists," Jack said suddenly, breaking the silence. Nate frowned. "What?" "The passengers," Jack said, his voice tight. "The people I flew here, they weren't tourists. They were something else." Nate stared at him, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What are you talking about?" Jack shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know, but they weren't normal. They didn't talk, didn't bring luggage. They just sat there like they knew what was coming." Nate's face paled. "You think they were part of this? The tribe, the altar, all of it?" Jack nodded slowly. "I think they were sacrifices." Nate let out a strangled laugh, the sound tinged with hysteria. "Jesus Christ, Jack. What the hell did you get us into?" Jack didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. The ridge was narrowing now, the rocky path giving way to steep drops on either side. One misstep could mean a quick end, but Jack welcomed the danger. It was better than waiting for the tribe to catch up. The ambush. They were halfway across the ridge when the first arrow hit. It struck the ground just inches from Jack's foot, the sharp thunk snapping him into action. He grabbed Nate and pulled him behind a large boulder, his heart pounding as more arrows rained down around them. "They found us," Jack muttered, his grip tightening on the machete. Nate let out a bitter laugh. "No kidding." Jack peered around the edge of the boulder, his eyes scanning the ridge. The tribe was closing in from both sides, their painted faces blending with the shadows. They moved with terrifying precision, their weapons raised, their guttural shouts echoing through the air. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his mind racing. "They'll pin us down." Nate gestured to the sheer drop on either side of the ridge. "And where exactly do you suggest we go?" Jack didn't answer. He scanned the terrain, his gaze landing on a narrow crevice in the rocks a few yards ahead. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "There," Jack said, pointing. "We make a run for it." Nate stared at him like he was insane. "We'll never make it." "We don't have a choice," Jack snapped. "On my mark. Ready? Go." They bolted from behind the boulder, arrows whizzing past them as they sprinted toward the crevice. Jack could feel the tribe closing in, their footsteps pounding against the rocky ground. He reached the crevice first, pulling Nate in behind him just as an arrow grazed his shoulder. The crevice was narrow and dark, the walls pressing in on either side. Jack could hear the tribe outside, their voices filled with rage as they searched for their prey. He held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. For now, they were safe, but he knew it wouldn't last. A desperate resolve. As night fell, the crevice grew colder, the air damp and heavy. Jack and Nate sat in silence, their bodies pressed against the rock. The tribe's voices had faded, but Jack knew they were still out there, waiting. "We can't keep running," Nate said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They'll hunt us down eventually." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we stop running." Nate frowned. "What are you saying?" Jack met his gaze, his eyes hard. "I'm saying we fight. We turn this around. They've been hunting us like animals. It's time we do the same to them." Nate stared at him, his fear giving way to something else. something darker. You're serious. Jack nodded. We don't have a choice. It's them or us. And as the darkness of the jungle pressed in around them, Jack made a silent vow. This would end, one way or another. Chapter 11. Blood on the Ridge. The night was a suffocating blanket of darkness, the jungle alive with the faint hum of insects and the occasional distant cry of an animal. Jack and Nate crouched in the narrow crevice, their bodies pressed against the cold rock. The air was damp and heavy, the silence broken only by their labored breathing. Jack's grip on the machete was tight, his knuckles white. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the knowledge that this might be their last stand. The tribe was out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. They won't stop, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. They'll keep coming until we're dead. Nate let out a shaky breath, his face pale in the faint moonlight. Then we don't give them the chance. Jack turned to him, his expression grim. You ready for this? Nate swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. No, but I don't think that matters anymore. Jack nodded, his chest tight. He wanted to say something, anything, that might ease the weight of what was coming. But there was nothing left to say. Survival didn't leave room for words. The ambush. The tribe struck just before dawn. Jack had barely closed his eyes when the first arrow struck the rock near his head, the sharp crack jolting him awake. He scrambled to his feet, dragging Nate up with him as the crevice echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps. They found us, Nate shouted, his voice raw with panic. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Nate and pulled him toward the narrow opening at the far end of the crevice. Move, now! They burst out into the open, the faint light of dawn casting long shadows across the ridge. The tribe was waiting. Dozens of painted faces emerged from the jungle, their eyes glinting with predatory hunger. They moved with terrifying precision, their weapons raised. Jack didn't think. He charged, the machete in his hand an extension of his will. He swung at the first attacker, the blade catching the man in the shoulder and driving him back. Blood sprayed across the rocks as the tribesman crumpled to the ground. Jack! Nate's voice was a desperate cry, pulling Jack's attention to his side. Nate was grappling with one of the tribesmen, the two of them locked in a brutal struggle. The man's knife flashed in the dim light, the blade slashing dangerously close to Nate's throat. Jack lunged forward, driving his shoulder into the attacker and sending him sprawling. Stay close, Jack shouted, his voice hoarse. Don't let them separate us. But the tribe was relentless. They came in waves, their weapons flashing as they pressed the attack. Jack fought with everything he had, his movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He could feel his muscles burning, his vision narrowing as exhaustion took hold. And then he heard it, the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Nate's scream. Nate's final stand. Jack spun around, his heart lurching in his chest. Nate was on the ground, a spear protruding from his stomach. Blood soaked his shirt, pooling around him as he clutched at the shaft with trembling hands. No! Jack's voice was a raw, guttural cry as he rushed to his friend's side. Nate's eyes met his, wide with fear and pain. Jack, Don't, Jack said, dropping to his knees beside him. He grabbed the spear, his hands slick with blood. I'm getting you out of here. Nate shook his head, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. It's too late. Shut up, Jack snapped, his voice breaking. Don't you dare give up on me. But deep down, he knew the truth. The wound was fatal. There was no saving him. Nate's hand gripped Jack's wrist, his fingers weak but insistent. You have to go, he said, his voice barely audible. They'll kill you too. Jack shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice, Nate said, his voice trembling. You have to make it, for both of us. Jack clenched his jaw, his heart shattering as he nodded. I'll come back for you, he said, his voice shaking. I promise. Nate managed a weak smile, his eyes beginning to glaze over. You were always the stubborn one. And then he was gone. The wound. Jack didn't have time to grieve. The tribe was closing in, their cries echoing through the ridge. He grabbed the machete and turned to face them, his body trembling with exhaustion and rage. The first attacker came at him with a spear, the weapon thrusting toward his chest. Jack sidestepped the blow, his machete slicing through the man's arm. The tribesman let out a guttural scream as he fell, but another took his place almost immediately. Jack fought like a man possessed, his movements fueled by anger and desperation. But he was outnumbered, his strength waning with every passing second. He felt a sharp pain in his side as a knife slashed through his shirt, the blade cutting deep into his flesh. He stumbled, his vision blurring as blood soaked his side. The pain was blinding, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't stop. Not now. Jack swung the machete wildly, catching another attacker across the chest. The man fell, his body crumpling to the ground. But more were coming, their painted faces twisted with rage. Jack knew he couldn't win. He was bleeding, exhausted, and alone. But he wasn't going to die without a fight. The escape. Jack's eyes darted to the edge of the ridge, where the steep drop-off led to the jungle below. It was a suicide leap, but staying meant certain death. He turned back to the tribe, his jaw tightening as he made his decision. With one final, defiant swing of the machete, he turned and ran toward the edge. Arrows whizzed past him, one grazing his arm as he leapt into the void. The fall was a blur, the world spinning around him as he tumbled down the rocky slope. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body, his injured side screaming in protest. But he was alive. Jack rolled onto his back, gasping for air as the jungle loomed above him. The tribe's cries were distant now, their pursuit delayed by the steep descent. He had bought himself time, precious, fleeting time. He pressed a hand to his side, his fingers coming away slick with blood. The wound was deep, but not fatal. Not yet. Jack forced himself to his feet, his body trembling as he stumbled into the jungle. He didn't know where he was going or how he was going to survive. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. For Nate. Chapter 12. The Last Hope. Jack's hands were raw, his palms blistered and bleeding as he tightened the final vine around the logs. His fingers trembled, slick with sweat and dirt, but he forced them to keep moving. The pain no longer registered. Not really. It was just another part of him now, like the burning ache in his legs or the sharp pull of the wound in his side. The raft was crude, pitiful even, but it was all he had. It was his last hope. Jack leaned back on his heels, staring at the uneven collection of logs lashed together with jungle vines. The raft was barely large enough to hold him, let alone anything else. It wasn't much, but it floated. He'd tested that much in the shallows, shoving it into the water and watching as the waves gently lifted it. It had to work. It had to. The jungle loomed behind him, a wall of green and shadow that seemed to press closer with each passing moment. He could feel the weight of it, the oppressive heat, the constant hum of insects. And somewhere in that tangled mess of trees and vines, the tribe was waiting. Watching. Jack's eyes darted toward the tree line, his chest tightening. He hadn't seen them since the night before, but their absence wasn't reassuring. It was worse. He knew they were still hunting him, still searching. And it was only a matter of time before they found him. Just a little longer, Jack muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. Just a little more. The materials. The process of building the raft had been a nightmare. Jack had spent hours scouring the jungle for the right materials, his machete hacking through the thick undergrowth as he searched for trees with straight, sturdy trunks. The effort had left him drenched in sweat, his muscles screaming with every swing of the blade. The wound in his side throbbed relentlessly, the makeshift bandage soaked through with blood and grime. He had found a handful of suitable trees near the edge of the jungle, their trunks thin but strong enough to hold his weight. Cutting them down had been slow, grueling work. The machete wasn't meant for this kind of labor, its blade dull and chipped from weeks of use. But Jack didn't have the luxury of stopping. Every wasted second was a second closer to death. When the first tree finally fell, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud, Jack had nearly collapsed beside it. His arms felt like lead, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He had no idea how he was going to drag it to the shore, but he had no choice. One by one, he had hauled the logs through the jungle, the rough bark scraping against his skin. The effort left him dizzy and nauseated, his vision swimming as his body screamed for rest. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had to keep moving. If he stopped, he wouldn't start again. The construction. Lashing the logs together had been another challenge. Jack had spent hours gathering vines from the trees, cutting them down and stripping them of their leaves. It was delicate work, his hands fumbling as he tied the knots as tightly as he could. The vines were strong, stronger than they looked. But they frayed easily, and Jack didn't trust them to hold under the weight of the logs. He tested every knot twice, pulling at the vines until his arms ached. The raft creaked and groaned as he worked, the logs shifting under his weight. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was the best he could do with what he had. By the time he finished, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the beach. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling as he leaned against the raft. His entire body felt like it was on the verge of collapse, every muscle screaming for relief. But there was no relief. Not yet. The paddle. The raft wasn't enough. Jack knew that much. Without a way to steer, he'd be at the mercy of the current, drifting aimlessly until the ocean swallowed him whole. He needed a paddle, something to push him forward, something to give him control. His eyes scanned the beach, searching for anything that might work. The shore was littered with debris, branches, driftwood, scraps of seaweed, but nothing seemed right. Nothing seemed strong enough. Finally, he found it. A long, sturdy branch half buried in the sand. It was thick enough to hold up against the waves, but light enough for him to wield without too much effort. Jack dragged it to the raft, his hands shaking as he used the machete to strip the bark and sharpen one end into a crude point. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Good enough, Jack muttered, testing the paddle's weight in his hands. It's going to have to be. The tribe's shadow. The jungle felt closer now, the air thick with tension. Jack could feel it pressing down on him, the weight of the tribe's presence like a physical force. He hadn't seen them, but he knew they were there. He could feel their eyes on him, watching from the shadows. He worked faster, his movements frantic as he made the final adjustments to the raft. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, set his nerves on edge. His hands fumbled with the vines, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "They'll come," he whispered to himself. "They'll come, and you'll be ready." Jack's mind raced as he worked, his thoughts a chaotic blur of fear and desperation. He couldn't afford to think about Nate, about the blood on his hands, about the lives he'd taken and the ones he couldn't save. There was only the raft, only survival. The sun dipped lower, the sky painted in hues of orange and red. Jack's body trembled with exhaustion, his vision blurring as he tied the final knot. The raft was ready, barely, but Jack wasn't sure if he'd live long enough to use it. The waiting game. Jack sat beside the raft, his machete resting across his knees. The tide was rising, the waves creeping closer with every passing moment. The jungle was a wall of darkness behind him, the faint rustle of leaves the only sign of life. He could feel his body shutting down, his muscles stiff and unresponsive. The wound in his side throbbed dully, the makeshift bandage soaked through with blood. Jack knew he was running out of time. The tribe would come for him, and when they did, he'd have to fight or die. "Just a little longer," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. Just a little longer. The night crept in, the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Jack tightened his grip on the machete, his eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. He didn't know if he'd make it through the night, but he wasn't going to give up, not yet. The final chapter. The escape on the raft, a barrage of arrows. Jack could barely breathe as he shoved the rickety raft into the crashing waves. The island loomed behind him, its dark jungle alive with the primal cries of the tribe. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, his hands shaking as he heaved the raft forward. The salty spray of the ocean stung his wounds, but he didn't dare stop. Stopping meant death. The first arrow came like a whisper of death, slicing past his ear and embedding itself in the sand beside him. Jack froze for a split second, his blood running cold. Then came another arrow, this one splintering against the wooden frame of the raft. He turned to look back, and his stomach dropped. The jungle had erupted with movement. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their bodies painted with streaks of red and black, their faces gnarled with fury. They moved together, like a swarm of predatory animals, their bows drawn taut. The glint of torchlight reflected off their sharp arrowheads. "Shit," Jack whispered, shoving the raft harder into the water. "Come on, come on!" The raft bobbed violently as it hit deeper water, but Jack had no time to steady it. He threw himself onto the creaking planks, grabbing the long wooden pole he had fashioned as an oar. The water climbed higher, waves crashing over the raft and soaking him to the bone. Then the arrows came. A storm of them. They rained from the sky, whistling as they tore through the air. Jack ducked instinctively, flattening himself against the raft as the projectiles thudded into the wood around him. One grazed his calf, slicing through the flesh and leaving a trail of blood. Another arrow struck the raft, lodging itself inches from his face. He pulled himself upright, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and started paddling with all his might. The raft groaned beneath him, the vines holding it together, straining against the relentless ocean. Another volley of arrows followed, this one even more precise. Jack felt the first one hit, a sharp, burning pain as it pierced his side. He gasped, clutching at the arrow protruding from his ribs, but there was no time to stop. A second arrow slammed into his shoulder, the force of it knocking him sideways. He cried out, his vision going white with pain. Blood poured from the wound, staining the rough wood of the raft. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the arrow shaft jutting out grotesquely, but he kept paddling with his good arm. The tribe's chants rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices echoing across the water. Jack risked a glance back and saw them lining the shore, their bows firing in unison. Another arrow struck him in the thigh, the tip tearing straight through the muscle and out the other side. His scream was swallowed by the crash of the waves. "I'm not dying here," he hissed through gritted teeth, his entire body trembling with agony. He bit down hard on his lip, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth as he forced himself to keep going. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one more painful than the last. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his battered body, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop. The next arrow buried itself in his lower back. Jack's body arched involuntarily as the pain exploded through him, his grip on the paddle faltering. His vision blurred, the edges going dark. But he held on. He had to hold on. He could hear the tribe's laughter, their mocking cries, and it fueled his desperation. They wanted him dead. They thought he would die. They were wrong. Another arrow struck the raft, splintering the wood beneath him. The raft began to list dangerously, the waves threatening to tip it over. Jack clung to the planks with bloodied fingers, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. His body was a pincushion of pain, arrows jutting from his flesh like grotesque ornaments, but he forced himself to keep paddling. Every stroke of the oar was a battle, his muscles screaming in protest, but the raft inched farther from the shore. The tribe's chants began to fade, their arrows falling short as the raft drifted into deeper water. Jack collapsed onto the planks, his body trembling uncontrollably. His vision swam, the stars above blurring together in a dizzying swirl. He could feel the warm stickiness of his own blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the wood. The island grew smaller in the distance, but its shadow still loomed large in his mind. He had escaped, but just barely. Every breath was a struggle, each one more shallow than the last. The pain was unbearable, his body broken and riddled with wounds, but he was alive, for now. The rescue, a cruel twist. Jack didn't know how long he drifted. Time had lost all meaning, his mind slipping in and out of consciousness. The ocean cradled him like a cruel mother, its waves lapping softly against the raft. He was numb, his body too far gone to feel the pain anymore. Only the sound of the water kept him tethered to reality. Then he heard it. A low, distant hum. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a cruel trick played by his dying mind. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. A boat. It had to be. Jack opened his eyes, the effort almost too much to bear. In the distance, he saw the faint glow of a lantern, the silhouette of a small fishing vessel cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over him, mingling with the pain. He raised his good arm weakly, the motion sending fresh agony through his side. "Help!" he croaked, his voice barely audible. The boat pulled alongside the raft, and two men leaned over the edge. They were rugged, their faces weathered by years at sea. One of them reached down, gripping Jack's arm and hauling him aboard. Jack cried out as the movement jostled his wounds, but he didn't resist. He was too far gone to fight. "You're lucky we found you," one of the men said, his voice thick with an accent Jack couldn't place. He smiled, but there was something off about it. Something wrong. Jack collapsed onto the deck, his chest heaving. He was alive. He had survived. But as he looked up at the men who had saved him, a cold dread began to creep over him. Their smiles weren't kind. They weren't even human. They were twisted, cruel, their teeth bared in something more akin to a snarl than a grin. Jack's heart sank as the boat veered off course, turning back toward the island. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, no, no." The men laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. The island grew larger in the distance, its dark silhouette a harbinger of doom. The tribe was waiting on the shore, their torches casting flickering shadows across the sand. The men threw Jack onto the beach without a word, their sinister grins never faltering. As the boat pulled away, Jack lay in the sand, his body broken, his spirit shattered. The tribe advanced slowly, their painted faces filled with unholy glee. Jack stared up at the sky, tears streaming down his face. He had escaped death, only to be dragged back into its clutches. And this time, there would be no escape. Thank you for listening to The Last Flight by Short Verse Creations. Would you have taken the job offer if you were Jack? Please like and subscribe for more epic tales.